So we'll get started. As you know, many successful entrepreneurs, when change career, like after they sell a few of their companies or take it public, they become professional venture investors, or they try to become venture investors. They end up facing a number of challenges, not only in raising funds, but also many times what I have heard is often asked by their investors or limited partners whether they could become successful venture investors. So, however, of course, we know a number of entrepreneurs who are also highly successful venture investors. You obviously know the names, but there are only few who are experts in spotting promising research and pairing it with business-savvy executives and researchers, commercialize it and bring it to the market. So we have an amazing speaker today, Amit Shah. He's founder and managing partner of Artiman Ventures, who not only has been a very highly successful serial entrepreneur, I think in a span of 5 years, he sold 2 companies, which you'll hear the stories from him, and also a successful venture investor now with the fund he founded, Artiman Ventures, about 10 years ago or so. So Amit focuses in something called white space opportunities. I'll leave it for him to talk more about it, but targets large markets across all business sectors, from materials, related technologies, construction, analytics, as well as even in motion sensing technologies. One of his companies had successfully gone public last year, InventSense. Many of you know probably a lot of their sensors are used in these phones, etc. Prior to that, Amit was founder of Pipelinks, which was acquired by Cisco, and then right before that, he was founder of ZiteNet, and that was acquired by Cabletron. And he has invested in a number of companies, sits on a number of private company boards as well as public companies. And so you can get ready with your questions so you can ask him, because he can give you a wide variety of his insights from all that wonderful experience over the last, I would say, 20 years. With that, I would like to invite Amit to share his exciting, amazing, and colorful entrepreneurial journey with us this evening. So let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. So I'm not good at talking about myself. I'm going to try to be a little quick and hopefully leave most of it to Q&A. But since I was asked to talk about my journey, just a quick synopsis for those of you from India. You know, the town that I grew up in has actually become famous simply because the current Prime Minister of India stood for elections from that town. Until recently, that was a sleepy college town. I came to the US to do a PhD in computer networking. And I think most people who came in that period really were focused on getting a job at something like a Bell Labs or TJ Watson. That was our goal. This is my quick summary. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each phase of the life, and mostly I'm going to talk about I've made a boatload of mistakes and unfortunately continue making them. But hopefully I can share a few of those. So again, for those of you from India, growing up lower middle class is, I think a bunch of you probably grew up middle class or lower. Is that fair? And what that meant is the only escape was education. And the parents insisted on that, and you knew that if you wanted to escape that, you had to work your butt off and hopefully get a good job. And one of the lessons we all learn is we always look incredibly smart once Lady Luck has struck. And my sort of chance meetings with luck began when I was in college. There was a summer when a former alum of the university had returned to India. And this was, I'm talking back in 1985. He basically came and gave a talk on optical communications. Now, to put this in perspective, in 1985, in India, there was not even copper communications, right? And the way he talked, he used to be with a company called Siemens Corning collaboration, was called Secor, and had come back because he was one of those patriotic Indians who wanted to help the Indian space program. And so he had set up shop at ISRO. And he gave a little spiel which was fairly inspiring. And knowing nothing, and I mean nothing about optical communications, I started applying in my senior year to grad school in optical communications, right? And I'll tell you why it led to some interesting things. The last issue was, if you have grown up in India, the ability to deal with, the corruption, the bribery, all of that was, I just didn't know how to deal with that. Especially when you are not, if you're not looking to do anything sort of off track, you still had to pay someone. And it just sort of nagged me. And so for me, I really was not keen on staying in India. I wanted to come to the US. And so coming to America was a movie which was an epiphany much later. So, and lastly, when you grow up lower middle class and your parents try to send you here, essentially they take on debt. And essentially you have no choice but to make sure you succeed because you have to pay off that debt. So that's the frame of reference with which I came to this country. So when I got here, I realized that there were very, very few people doing anything in computer networking. In fact, most of my friends who came here were really in computer science or computer engineering, which really meant chip design. Because back in the 80s, those were the two hot fields. And I felt like a little bit of a fool because I'd sort of blindly done this, fairly confident in myself, but no clue when I came here. But here I was, and I was clearly an outlier. And the reason I bring this up is one of the lessons I learned in life is when life gets lonely, and believe me, it gets lonely quite a few times, right? It is very critical to understand why you made the choice in the first place and not kind of start wavering. And in this case, I did not waver, but I had other stupidities to commit. So again, coming from India, I had no idea what startups were. So literally, as I'm joining, my professor decides to quit and do a startup. Not knowing what a startup was, I asked a few people around me and discovered, as a bunch of people said, most professors start startups and use grad students as cheap manual labor. And so I said, I really want to go work at TJ Watson and stuff. This is really not my cup of tea. And I said no, right? And I learned a few things there, right? There was a reason I had picked this professor, but in asking for a lot of opinions, I forgot about that. And so I did not join him, right? And the reason I say blew it is that little company is called Qualcomm. And my professor was Dr. Viterbi. So trust me, there were 4 of us fools who said no. And we talked about it on every anniversary and basically drank ourselves silly every night. So that was the first lesson. And if anybody has done a PhD, when you lose your professor, changing an advisor is not trivial. You kind of have to rebuild. So I decided to go look for a job. And that's when I came to the Valley in 1989. And one of the first things I discovered about the Valley was it used to be very rural. And I don't know how many of you were here in the 80s, but 90% of what you see today was farmland. Right? And it was actually a little uncanny and unnerving because you're used to this image of Silicon Valley at the time, and it was mostly farmland. Put a little more context, in those days, the biggest companies were HP and Intel, right? And National was on its decline. Some of you may not even know those names, but the hottest companies to work for were Sun. And Cisco had just started becoming hot, but nobody really knew what Cisco was, Right? It was just the early days. And Oracle was one of the bigger players. Is that working? Silicon Graphics was there. Yep. Yep. Apple was not as hot. Now, I'm saying the hottest companies. Yep. So if you were an engineer, if you had a choice, yes, Silicon Graphics would be in that list, right? And nah. And here I was working for, and I also ran, right? A company called AMD. In those days, it was known as the second source company to Intel, right? And it was a fascinating because all my friends were working for these hot companies, and they would talk about all the interesting things they were doing, and I would talk about, we had a bad quarter, and there might be some more layoffs, right? So the issue was, what do I do? And I quickly realized I was not a hotshot engineer, not working in a hotshot company, not in a hotshot field. What do you do? And at least this part of it was deliberate, which is I just decided on a lark to say, you know what, at the minimum, let me at least try to become an expert in the field. Field was networking, high-speed networking is what I'd picked, right? So I said, how the heck do you go about doing that? Didn't have a clue. And I actually called up my professor, and he actually made a very interesting statement. He said, teach, right? You learn the most when you teach. So I said, how do I sign up? So he actually introduced me to a friend of his who was a professor at Berkeley, and I started teaching at Berkeley. I would work at nights preparing all the slides, reading up a boatload of material, and every class I would get stumped because some of the dumbest questions would get asked for which I had no answer. Right? So lesson number one I learned is there are no dumb questions, but there is a little thing called if you really don't understand something well, if you have just gloated over it, if you've skimmed over it, you will at some point hit the issues. Right? So it is very important to really understand something inside out. And it really taught me a lot on that. A little more emboldened, I really said, let me go write a book. And no idea what to do it. I was involved in a standards committee. There was a network standard coming out at the time called FTDI. Decided to write a book. And conned a publisher into accepting me as an author, wrote a book, sort of became a reference book, and I was extremely proud when I received my first royalty check, and very quickly realized that that was a delusion, because apparently they always give you at least a little bit of royalty, and after 3 months there was no more royalty checks. And I sold probably a grand total of 5,000 books. But interesting experience again, learned a lot. And the most important thing it led to was consulting. And I started consulting with some very interesting people. And I got exposed to just a boatload of people. The biggest lesson I learned is the best way to improve your luck is meet interesting people. And maybe I was stupid enough not to know it, but at least I got to meet some of the most interesting people, including you'll see, a tall, lanky German called Andy Bechtolsheim, and I'll tell a little story on that. But I kind of, because of that little exposure on the book and the classes, people would talk about me, and then I got to consult with this dinky little company called Cisco. And they were in a little building on Middlefield Road, and their head of customer support called me and said, look, a bunch of my engineers took your class. They speak highly of you. Could you help us when we deploy, our routers in some of these networks? I had no idea what a router was, frankly. I had all theory. Remember that, right? He had no idea what I did not know. And so we kind of said, sure, let's try it. And the first assignment he gave me was he called me at 11 o'clock at night, said, are you free? I said, what do you think? He said, you are free. I said, good. I need you to drive to Apple right now. I said, why? He said, just go there. You're going to get chewed out, but stay calm. I said, what is he talking about? Huh? This gentleman's name was Link Verstehen. If those of you, and anybody who was at Cisco at the time, he was the first manager of customer support there. So I land up at Apple. And truly pardon my French, because I get there, and it's 11 o'clock at night, some engineer comes at the door, opens the door, points this at me and said, "What the F are you doing here? And who the heck are you?" I had no idea. I had no Cisco badge. I had nothing. And he just berated me for 5 minutes. Some Cisco guy shows up. They take us in, discover that Cisco, this is, you talk about how you deployed things in those days. Cisco had apparently deployed a backbone routers for Apple. And that evening, some engineer had decided to modify the code and uploaded it. And their entire network was flapping, and flapping badly, right? And anybody who had worked for Jobs, when he gets mad, everybody just panics. And so the shit flew downhill, and I was the lowest guy on the totem pole, so I was apparently being paid to take the abuse. And not knowing anything about the network, I just worked around it. But what was fascinating was I firsthand saw what a data center could look like. There was no data center. Firsthand saw the impact of the technology that we were all talking about on productivity and what was happening from a customer base standpoint. Because little did I know, at that time, Singapore was where Apple was for Asia, and that was precise hour that Singapore uploaded everything into the network, right? And all hell had broken loose. And so learned a few lessons about it, mainly understanding the difference between technology and business. And those were the little lessons that really started helping me. And so I kept consulting for about 4 years. If those of you know Mario Mazzola and Prem Jain, I was again another idiot. I consulted with them when they were doing a dinky little startup out of Mario's apartment. He insisted I join him. I kept refusing. Prem told me to join them. Like a fool, I kept saying no and did not join them. And they got acquired for 230 or 40 million by Cisco and didn't really understand the ramifications of that. So at some point when I saw all these things happening and I saw a lot of people doing startups and stuff, I guess the Guju blood in me kicked in or whatever. I just decided I need to do something. I've been in my job for a grand total of 4.5 years, right? So it's not as if I'd spent a whole lot of time doing much. Now, one other thing, that AMD experience was invaluable in an entirely different note. AMD used to really be just a chip company, but in 1986, Jerry Sanders, who was a founder, had decided that he really wanted to be a leader in some field. So he had hired McKinsey. McKinsey had told him, go into networking. And the guy was a bold guy. Back in those days, he took $50 million and gave it to one of his, he was a CEO of the company, a guy called Tony Holbrook, and said, go figure out networking. Now, in those days, if you came from the semiconductor industry, they knew jack shit about jack shit other than how to make chips. So Tony had no idea what networking was. The first thing he did is he licensed the Ethernet protocol and the chips from Digital. It used to be called the Dix Ethernet. Next thing he did is he said, I need to go get a team. He hired a few people, and I was the junior-most guy on the totem pole that was hired in. Within a few months, I quickly realized nobody else knew about networking other than 3 of us. The 3 of us knew nothing about chips. And it was a completely peaceful world until Tony Holbrook started getting pressure to deliver something. So he started taking us to Jerry Sanders' staff meeting. So you understand in those days, here I was the junior-most engineer on the totem pole, and I was attending Jerry Sanders' staff meeting. What I learned was he had a tantrum that he could throw at any time. What I also learned was the networking business that we were trying to do was an absolutely insignificant piece for them because they were in the business of selling wafers. Right? And us selling 1,000 chips and rah-rahing each other was so irrelevant to them. But I got exposure because nobody else knew networking, so they would take me to IBM, Digital. I would meet the customers, and they would all look at me strangely because I was truly the junior-most guy. And I know I don't look it, but believe me, I was a very thin, skinny Indian. And people just didn't know what to do with me. But I learned a lot because you got exposed to very senior level decisioning at a time when the world was changing. And I firsthand saw Digital and IBM. And I actually predicted it, but I wish I had the money to do something like that. I could tell Digital was going to fail. and you could see IBM transitioning. And that was the most important thing that taught me how people really did things. So started my first startup called Zeitnet, right? And I have learned a few things. Stupidity is absolutely a synonym of bravery, right? And the biggest reason I say that is I had no idea what I was going to do in the startup. But I quit my job cold turkey, started the company with 3 other fools, and essentially kind of was hoping for things to come along, I guess. Consulted for a while, bootstrapped it. We actually did that for about a year, and I still remember in December, or this started in 93, in December of that year, we actually had about a $5 million book of business on the consulting side, which is a pretty healthy book of business for those days. And cold turkey, we said no to a $1 million contract from HP in December. And the reason was I wanted to transition to a product company. Didn't have the money. I picked a VC that I really wanted to work with. It was a gentleman called Roger Evans. He was at Greylock. He had been one of the founders he'd founded 2 networking companies, including Ascend, and I really wanted him on my board. I approached him and he said, I've never seen a consulting shop change into a product shop. Prove it to me. So essentially he said no. And so I whiled away at it for a few months. And this is where, having met Mario in an earlier life, I went to Mario. By then he was at Cisco, and I just begged him. I said, hey, give me some contract, give me something. And to his credit, he did. Somehow the word got back, and talk about serendipity. In those days, there was no all these venture incubators and all the things that you see where it's like everybody and their brother seems to know about venture. In those days, there was nothing about venture. And Ernst & Young had started something to help out startups, and then Coopers & Lybrand had started a similar thing. And there was a gentleman called Brian Goncha. He'd come by, said, hey, can I help you? I said, yeah, I'll take any help you can. He introduced me to his managing partner. He listened to me and he said, I have no idea what you're talking about, but I caught the word networking. And I am the auditor for Cisco. I know the VP of sales there. Why don't I introduce you to him? Right? And he says, he's a little bit of a strange guy, but he's a genius. Why don't you talk to him? I said, I'll take any introductions. That gentleman's name was Terry Eggers. And Terry was the first VP of sales at Cisco. Now, I don't know if anybody knows Terry, but he literally built Cisco from ground up. And if you credit anybody for building the Cisco sales machinery, that was him. And this guy was absolutely irreverent, dyslexic, ADD, but brilliant. And people had warned me that it's completely unpredictable. And so we had this little shop, which was essentially, we had rented the front office of a garage. Shows up there, we are talking about things, and I'm trying to present my little presentation, and he whacks me on the head. And he goes, what are you trying to be? I said, I'm trying to do this company. He said, do you want to be a CEO or do you want to be an engineer? I said, CEO. Then he said, shut this crap down. Right? And just lectures me on what it means to run a business. Now, the good news was, I said, hey, I'll take the abuse. Will you actually help me? He said, I can't be on your board because I'll be too disruptive, but I'll help you. He introduces me to a gentleman called Ed Kozel, who was a CTO of Cisco. Right? I mean, talk about how this sequence of events works. If anybody knows Ed Kozel, Ed is the architect of the whole M&A strategy and exactly how Cisco grew. Right? And Ed comes in because of him. Before I know it, the word spreads to Sequoia, NEA, and a whole bunch of other VC firms. And the same guy who had knocked on their door 50 times over suddenly was inundated with people wanting to get in the door. Not much had changed. Right? So 2 things, right? Knowing all the right people did help. It did make a difference. Having all the right people speak good things about you did make a difference. The last thing that happened was, while I had all these people showing up, back in those days, if you were Indian, you were considered a great VP of engineering. But CEO, nope. And so I was desperately looking for somebody who could help me, just because I said, people would very nicely say, look, why don't you come in? Yeah, you're a founder, but we'll bring in a CEO later. So I went to Kanwal, and Kanwal, and I got introduced to him through his banker. And Kanwal, as most of you might know, has a speech impediment. So he said, look, not only was I Indian, but nobody could understand me, right? And I still managed to succeed. I said, that's why I want you on my board. So I had a board which was the most interesting board at that time, because I had a VC, and I'll come to the VC story, but I managed to raise money at a very high valuation for the time, which was a mistake, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I had Ed Cozell, I had Roger Evans, I had Kanwal, and then before that, what I didn't talk about is absolutely randomly I had gotten introduced to this German called Andy Beckelsheim. He shows up at our office, and we have this presentation, and he grills us left, right, and center. And at the end of it, about 2 hours later, he says, how much money do you need? He had no idea. We said $1 million, right? He pulls out a checkbook, writes out a check. I actually did not know how to count the zeros, right? We ran with the check, 6 of us, to the bank. We did not, and there was no photocopier that we could make a real copy, and nobody would accept a photocopy, so there were 6 of us escorting the check. And the way we celebrated that check was Cobra malt liquor, right? The cheapest liquor we could find. But again, Andy played a lot of roles in my life down the road as well. Again, meeting the good people, learning from them, understanding how people worked, was a recurring theme that I felt I got very lucky on. And I will take that luck over anything else. Zeitnet, which was my first startup, was the most interesting thing was I really had never managed any person before, grew to 140 people, and would shiver when people would be buying homes on the basis of their job at Zeitnet. And I'm like, I have no idea what's happening tomorrow, and these people are buying homes on that basis. Right? That was a very, very unnerving feeling. Then we went through a high. Goldman Sachs was going to take us public. We were doing $5 million a quarter. In those days, a $25 million annual run rate was a big deal. And then Cisco decided that ATM, which is what I was in, ATM networking, was not going to be their forte. They were my largest OEM. They canceled every order. So I went from trying to go public to laying off my people, trying to scramble, and trying to just keep the company afloat. Right? Learned a lot, learned who really are your friends, learned who really will stand by you. And I'll give you a simple example, right? I went to Mario, and I said, Mario, I know you're getting out of the ATM business. I need your help. I said, if you don't give me something right now, I'll have to shut the company down, right? And I'll never forget, literally, if anybody knows Mario, he smokes, and we walk around the building. And basically, he said, how much do you need? I said, 2 million. I said, fine. You'll get a purchase order for 2 million tomorrow, right? That's it. We freaking shook hands, and I was able to save the company, and we actually sold it for a record price at the time. And the lesson here was, again, meeting the right people, developing that trust, having that trusted relationship, right? All of these little cycles keep on repeating. So anyways, that's my little story on that. And by the way, I think I was the first formal angel fund. Started in 1996. It was called Antillian Capital. And that's another story, which is, it's incredible how success makes you think you're so much smarter, right? And I sell the company, and the next day, apparently everybody thought I was smarter. Well, I started believing that as well, right? And you get in way over your head. And it takes a few hard knocks to realize, no, you're the same dumb schtick you were, right? And so I started that angel fund because I got full of myself, right? And it was a formal angel fund with, full documentation and stuff. And realized a few interesting things, which was, I started trying to do the angel fund, and I discovered I was not ready to be a VC. And one of the companies I'd seeded, because I had all these ideas of whatever the problems were, and by now I was into this mode of starting companies because, oh, that's a problem, let's go solve it. Let's create a company. And I started my second company called Pipelinks. And this is where I learned another interesting lesson. Because Ed Kozel was on my board and he was my mentor, I would meet every month. So I'm describing to him what I'm doing at Pipelinks. And he says, I need you to do this at Cisco. I said, no, I'm doing this at Pipelinks. He said, you don't understand. You're going to do this at Cisco. I said, what do you mean? I'm acquiring you. I have no product. Doesn't matter. I'm acquiring you. Now, the reason this sounds very good, and I got very puffed up that, wow, he wants to acquire me before I have a product. But the biggest difference was if I had the conviction and if I had stuck with the company and built a business, right, I would have made a boatload more money and created something of substantively more value. However, greed and laziness are an amazing trait, right? And what landed up happening is I looked at it and said, man, the hardest thing in a company is sales, right? And here what he was saying is you don't need to do any selling. Come in inside Cisco and you do the selling as Cisco. So I succumbed to that and I sold the company. Now, I did learn a lot during that period. But in those of you, if you remember that period, it was Cisco between 98 and 2000 was Google, Facebook, LinkedIn combined, right? My most tiring moments at Cisco used to be the fact that John would meet with a president or a head of state every frigging day. What that really meant was us minions had to run around servicing them, right? And in hindsight, you realize that what was happening was a revolution, but at the same time, everybody wanted to be associated with that revolution, right? And I sat right behind John Chambers. In watching the company add a few thousand people a week, watching the company grow at $1 billion a month clip was one of the most astounding experiences I could have ever had, right? And it was during that period where, because I was affiliated with Ed Kozel, I kind of became part of the inner circle. And because Mario knew me, it didn't matter, right? And there was this guy, or kid at that time, called Mike Volpe. The first deal that he had ever done was an investment in Zeitnet because Ed had hired him and he said, Amit, can you tutor him? I'm going to have him do your deal, right? These little sort of connections kept coming through. And those of you know Mike was extremely successful. And we actually became friends and he actually helped me a lot when I was starting Artiman. So what we learned a lot, but at the same time, I still remember one board meeting where we had this motto called double the business, right? And I was smoking, well, like I said, whatever this stuff was, it was good stuff, right? And I remember the sobering discussion was when one of the sales guys said, guys, that's all nice and dandy, but doubling the business from 5 billion to 10 billion is non-trivial, right? And that was the first time it kind of, through the haze, it said, you know what? Maybe he's got a point. Unfortunately, nobody listened to him. Don't worry, just power through this. And you know what happened, the rest is history. So why did I leave Cisco? My admin had been with me through both my startups, so she knew me quite well. And one fine day, she says, you suck at this job. Right? And the reason she said that was I was stunned. And you got to understand, at that time, I had the proverbial corner office. I had done the largest acquisition ever, which was Serent. I created the optical business unit at Cisco. I was having a great time, I thought. And she made two observations. She said, I don't see you coming in with a smile on your face. Number two, I set up all your meetings, and more than half the meetings are bitching and whining meetings, right? There's no way you can enjoy it. That's not your skill set. You're not an operations person for that. And she was right? And I instantly decided to quit. This was in late 99. And the amazing thing was, my first call was to Ed Kozel, and it was almost as if Ed was expecting it. He said, just come over. So I go over to his office, and he says, you're not quitting. Now, he was my mentor. I said, why? He said, I knew you were going to quit at some point, but you're not quitting right now. Because Carl Russo, who was the CEO of Serent, he may quit. I need you to run it if he quits. So I stuck around. By March, he had a little bit of a disagreement with John, and Ed leaves. So I call him and said, now I can leave? He said, yes. So, so I tried to quit, and they wouldn't let me leave. So I kept hammering at them for 6 months. In fact, I told everybody who worked for me that you should not be working for me because I really am going to leave. You should not impact your own career. So they finally let me go, and they were very gracious. Cisco actually put a huge chunk of money in my first fund. But that's how I decided to quit. Now, why did I do the fund? Right? So the dark side was a very interesting discussion. I'd done the angel fund, done well in the first angel fund, done okay in the second angel fund, mainly because the concept of washouts had come about. Right? We are right now going through a very interesting bubble. Everything seems to be very good. For those of us who have lived through a few crashes, there are some very dark side issues to it. One of the biggest issues was, even though there were companies I had which are doing spectacularly well, I didn't have the capital to sustain my equity. And so I was getting washed out. And I realized I really had changed. And the biggest difference between a VC and a CEO is literally, like I said, the parent versus a coach, right? Your CEO is like a parent. A parent can take a lot more liberties with their kid. A coach can't, right? A coach has to do it through sort of inspiration, through just coaching. You can't really do it too directly. That's precisely the problem with having been an entrepreneur, because your tendency is to get in there and do it yourself, right? But over the years, I kind of internalized that and decided maybe I can be the VC, and I wanted to raise a full fund and go do it. So that's how I crossed over, because I realized I knew I could do startups. I had done enough. I could have done a few more. I wanted a different challenge. I said, let me try my hand at this. I really enjoyed meeting people. I loved sharing my experiences on being the entrepreneur with people, and said, maybe I can do this for a living. And that's how I really started. And believe me, making money was the last. And if anybody here is a VC, it is the last thing that you think about, only because it's hard to make money. But so why did I start Artiman? Why not join another firm? Right? And I had offers to become partner at other firms. I just felt that if you're going to do something different, do it yourself. Go try to create a different brand. Try to create something different. I frankly didn't know what the difference would be, but I just wanted to do something where I could control the destiny a little bit more. And I was hoping that this would be my final startup. So just a quick, this is a very quick summary of Artiman. So we started in 2000 and promptly hit 9/11. So I'll talk a little bit about what happened with that. When we started, frankly, we had started because we could. Right? I could raise money, so I raised the money. Did I have a real strategy? Hell no. Right? This was the good times. And so when 9/11 hits, it's like, oh shit. Right? And it was very clear the world did not need another VC. Right? The Valley had enough venture funds. So one of the biggest decisions I had was, how do I pivot? And so here I had raised the fund, but here I had no strategy. And I was trying to figure out what to do about it. And one of the first things that we learned was, this whole concept of white space. Let me talk a little bit about that, and I'll get into it in more detail. I said, how do I differentiate? So my mentor was Mike Moritz. Sequoia was an investor in both my startups. And I went to Mike and said, Mike, what would you do in my situation? And I said, do not tell me to shut the fund, right? So tell me anything else. And he made a very interesting comment. He said, in times of danger, people flee to perceived quality. So I said, what do you mean? He says, look, your investors, when they see this kind of a big meltdown happen, they're most likely going to come to a few brands, the Sequoias, the Greylocks, the Axels. And he said, most of us are going to be undisciplined. I said, what do you mean? He says, most early stage venture funds need to be in the 200 to 300 million range. If you are $1 billion fund, it's very hard to do sustained early stage, right? So he said, now look at your guys' background. You have done startups, you understand early stage, you have a pool of capital. If you stay focused on the early stage, hopefully over a period of time, if your companies do well, you'll have a slightly differentiated story. I said, that's interesting. Then I asked him the second question. I said, but Mike, when I look at a Sequoia report, I was also an investor in Sequoia, I said, I can tell by the description of the company that this is a Moritz company. Why? And then he gave me the interesting answer, which is he said, look, my mentor in the business was Don Valentine. And he said, Don taught me never to be a power running back. Right? And this was a most interesting lesson that he basically, I said, what do you mean? And he goes, look, power running is about momentum, and big companies can gain more momentum than you. Be a slasher. Big companies cannot sidestep. Right? And that was a clicker for us to say, okay, innovate, but be orthogonal. Try to do a little differently. Don't try to do mainstream. Do not try to go mainline. Right? Frankly, if there are 50 cloud companies and there are 500 VCs wanting to fund 50 cloud companies, where am I adding any differentiation? Where am I adding the value? And that struck home. And so we literally spent a few years trying to figure out that, right? And that led to a very simple distillation. And it took us a few iterations, right? We went after white spaces, meaning we want to be the first in the market. We want to go after large markets. And believe me, over a period of time, the definition of markets increased. If we used to think $1 billion TAM was very large, we moved it to 10 billion today. And the reason is, as all of us know, TAMs are pulled out of the air, and they usually shrink, not increase. So we realized $1 billion TAM was really a $500 million at best. So that's why we focused on larger TAMs. The other thing we discovered is if you think about innovation, there are two kinds of innovation, incremental and disruptive. Incremental is when I'm in the field, the next thing I do, the sequential thing I do, the linear thing I do is always incremental. Right? And I'm going to give you a few examples of companies where people when you think out of the box, what we discovered with multidisciplinary is if you can bring people together with entirely different backgrounds and have them think about problems, you actually find innovative solutions. And we have several companies, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we are very big believers in multidisciplinary. And the large markets I just talked about. Okay? So I think I told you this is a personal sort of peeve of mine. I did not build large businesses, and I thought I made a mistake in that. So one of the passions I have is I want entrepreneurs who are really looking forward to building large businesses and whatever I could do to help them build that. So this is one of the key themes we focus on. So just some pointers about, there are two programs I just want to mention. About 50% of our deals are what we call entrepreneurs in residence. And we started this program about a decade ago. And the reason we started this program is white spaces is harder than you think. In fact, it's extremely hard. Let me give you an example of a white space. We came close to investing in portable nuclear energy, right? And by the way, we didn't, Bill Gates did. And the reason was we have a friend in the State Department who said, this could get regulated. You may want to stay out of that. Right? Because we had done a study on clean tech, and we discovered the cleanest energy is actually nuclear. But we said, don't do that, we'll move on. So we wanted entrepreneurs. We realized that the biggest risk anyway is your relationship with the entrepreneur. And if you can build a trusted relationship, a lot of the issues go away. Because I don't know of a startup, I don't know if you guys do, that started here and stayed on that same course. There is no startup which maintains the same course. So that means you need to have a team which knows how to navigate that. The best way for us to build that relationship is get to know an entrepreneur almost before they have an idea. Now, our EIR program is a little unique in the sense we take no more than 3 or 4 at a time. And it's an interview process which is all the partners, but also all our entrepreneurs. And it's a mutual thing, and we really reinforce this with every entrepreneur that make sure you really feel comfortable with who we are. Because we have our warts, just like we want to know your warts, you better know our warts. Second problem is we require our EIRs to go without salary for up to a year. Right? And the reason a year is it takes up to a year to build a white space plan. Why do we require them to go without salary? We debated this back and forth a lot. We want entrepreneurs, not employees. Right? Now, what is the advantage of being an EIR with us? There is no EIR who does not get funded by us. The deal structure is upfront, and the dollars are independent of the deal structure. So if your business plan needs X million dollars, that's there. Right? So we started this, frankly, early on by asking our friends in the industry and sort of just bamboozling them into coming and being entrepreneurs with us. Luckily for us, some of those companies have started doing quite well. And so we get a lot of people coming in. And if anybody is interested, we like people to have some skill, which is unusual, where they're different, where they have some expertise, which is unusual and different. And we recommend, if you haven't made enough money, it's hard. And we don't want people to kind of start looking at the wall and getting nervous about having to earn a paycheck, because it takes time. But the ER program is about 50% of our deals. The second program that we initiated last year is a beta program. And this started on a different note. Here in the Valley, we have a lot of apps companies, right? And we are not good at apps, right? By the way, I passed on YouTube. Mike Moritz had shown it to me. I passed not because I didn't think it would do well, but I had no idea how to make money. And neither did they. Neither did Mike. Mike said, yeah, I don't know how they'll make money, but it's a good deal. And I passed, right? And to Sequoia's credit, they sold it to Google, and then Google spent a few $1 billion before it became cash flow positive, but hats off. So we don't know why Facebook succeeded and MySpace failed. We are not good at that. One thing we are very comfortable in our own skin is, if it's a space we don't know, we are not hesitant to say, we don't know what to do with it. So we'll move out of that. We don't invest in hot sectors, right? We really like to find fundamental value and fundamental deals. If you're an entrepreneur that's looking for that, we love it. Now, beta came about because a lot of the hard sciences people were ignoring, including at Stanford. So we started looking at this whole thing and saying, we got to figure out a way how to help these hard sciences majors in a different way. And we started the origins of the program about 4 years ago. We work with a lot of universities. And so beta stands for the biology, engineering, technology, and arts. And we basically have a sort of a committee of about 20 odd professors who are world-renowned, multidisciplinary. We take nominations from any professor or any individual if they think there's a remarkable student, preferably either senior, the lowest we go is a senior at an undergrad level, or a grad student, or it could be another professor doing some remarkable work in the sciences. Last year we got nominations for about 100. We picked about 15. We flew them over at our cost to the Valley. We spent 2 days with them. We gave them exposure to how to think about business, how to meet, how to do startups. We introduced them to a bunch of engineering senior execs, marketing, and a whole bunch of other people. That program has actually done wonderful things, because then we try to pair them, if they want to do a company, with entrepreneurs, including IRs. If they need a partner to think through the business, and people love that. We've had some pretty interesting people who have shown up for beta, okay? Last thing is, we actually have a full resource kit of everything about a startup in terms of, if you're going to, how do you conduct a board meeting? What are the reporting formats? Why do people like certain things? This is a standard toolkit, but if you want, it's all there, okay? So that's, just one last thing. One of the things we focus on is what we call feature, product, or company, right? And we're always trying to figure out the difference, because it could be a great feature, right? And believe me, there is no science to it. It's an art. And I wish there was an easy answer to it. But so a few things we discovered. What we discovered is, if you really look at, I don't know if everybody can see, but essentially there are few companies that can do one product and really create a massive TAM, right? And Google did that with a search. Oracle did that with a database. But most companies create a series of products that they eventually create a big enough play, right? So if you look at a Cisco, if you look at an HP, they really created a series of products. Most companies, most startups, if you don't create a series of products, your problem is by the time you get to market, you're on the tail end. So if you look at most of the startups that try to go public, within a year or two, they die. And the reason is because it takes you 4 years to develop something. It takes you about 2 years to gain enough momentum. By then, the technology is beginning to move on. So either you have the resources to develop the next generation, not just a product, but some other things, which is extremely hard to do unless you have thought through it from day one. And it's a very hard, difficult problem. Right? There are no easy answers to it. But we discovered that you can either have hope to get a Google, or you try to build a company which has enough platform technology to kind of keep building multiple generations of products. Okay? I have slides on my companies and stuff for examples, but I can shut up right now. Yep. No, GoPro, we actually have a company which was a pioneer and screwed up big time. And it's a company called Looksee. GoPro is a point product. Right? So you should watch what happens. It's going to be interesting to see how they take off beyond this. Now, can they evolve? Yes, they can. It depends on how they quickly evolve, or can they make that evolutionary change. But it's a good idea. We had also recognized the same issue, that cameras were not where they were. Right? A very simple problem they had solved identically is, when you are holding a camera, you are not in the moment. You have to be in the moment, and that's the experience piece. So they identified the right issue, but maintaining that is not going to be easy. Okay? I have other slides, but I think I'll pass. Okay?
You want to show other slides?
I mean, I have, do you want to see examples of some of our portfolio? Okay. So by the way, just one thing on Google, I'm sure everybody knows it, but people don't realize that the fundamental issue with Google, which a lot of us saw and predicted by 2003 that they were going to win, and it had nothing to do with technology. But one of the interesting things we learn in markets, because unfortunately we have losers, so our company, Looksee, has lost to GoPro, and we decided to pull out of the consumer market. Because there is something, when you start, the cost of development, the cost of recruiting, the cost of marketing is about the same for every startup. Right? About a year into it, that space, you start getting separation. Some companies become hot, others not so much. So the first place it shows up is your cost of recruiting goes up. Right? Good people want to join the hotter companies. So now you have to work a lot harder to recruit the people. What that means is you usually land up paying more. So your cost of development goes up. Slowly, your cost of marketing goes up. Right? By about the fourth year, it is literally impossible to catch up. So think about a 100-meter race. Right? In the first 10 meters, you have a chance at catching up if you're 20% faster than the other runner. By the 30th meter, if you're behind by more than 5 meters, you just can't catch up. So when Microsoft came out and they were late, Ballmer knew that he was late. That's why he wanted to acquire Yahoo when he did. And Yahoo was stupid. Right? That if they had merged, they at least had a chance. Ballmer knew that was his only hope of catching Google. But they didn't. Now, between 2000 and 2003, Google did one amazing thing, because one of our companies, Virident, he was a professor who was hired by Google, and he was one of the chief architects on the infrastructure side. So if people know the data centers, do you know what was the cost of, let's say, per search for Google versus Microsoft Bing? And you can say it in X terms. If Google search cost was X per search, what do you think was the cost for Bing? It's about 5X. Do you know why? This is where I give a hats off to Larry and Sergey. So no, Google basically decided no hard disk. They went with a RAM-only server architecture. Right? Did they have to develop software to make sure that they could recover? Hell yes. But what it did is they had much less failure, faster times, whereas Microsoft went with a 3-tier architecture, extremely complex, and when you think about 1 million servers or 10 million servers, extremely expensive. Right? Microsoft had more money than them at that point. Remember that? No, I'm saying at that point, in 2003, Microsoft had more money than God, but that was a mistake they made. Second thing Google was smart about, our founder at Virident, he was just yanked out of NYU, right, and paid an obscene amount of money. And we asked him, what are we going to do? He says, I had no idea. Sergey just came, camped in New York, went to Columbia, NYU, a few other places, just picked 10 professors and said, you're coming, right? And they just locked up a whole lot of talent. So it's important to understand when to also not fight a war, right? Sometimes the battle is okay to move on from. And Google was a great example where by 2003 it was over. Okay, just some companies of ours. So we have a construction company, and he was an EIR. In fact, the founder, there were two founders, but the original founder was one of the designers on the follow-on Pentium teams at Intel. Right? Came to us after having been part of the founding team. He was not the founder of a company, had made some money, and basically wanted to build yet another Wi-Fi solution or some wireless solution. I said, screw that. Do something different. Came from home one day, and you could see he was pissed. And I said, what happened? He says, well, we are doing some remodeling in the kitchen, and my wife got mad because the contractor is screwing up. I said, yep, that sounds familiar. Then we both started talking, and we realized it's the largest industry in the world, but there is nobody in the world who's happy with construction, right? Doesn't matter where you are. So we said, what could we do about that? And he started looking at it. He, by the way, was really at it. He was as an EIR with us for 18 months, right, before he got the idea of completely locked and loaded. Now, by the way, as part of the EIR program, we cover costs. So traveling, food, meetings, conferences, all of that we cover. So all the costs are covered. We just don't pay a salary. So he traveled around the world, met the largest construction companies, understood everything. And then he had a simple hypothesis. He said, if you take every building from Seattle to San Diego, and you take every connection that goes into every building, water, sewage, electricity, communications, he says it's a fraction of the number of connections in a Pentium chip. He says, when I was at the Pentium team, we were given 3 instructions. First, every application better work, right? So you can't say on the next generation, Excel works 99% of the time. You just have to have everything work. There will be a bunch of new features, whether it's low power, graphics, whatever. Some new features will be added. And number 3, it better work right the first time or you're fired, right? How do you achieve that? You simulate the entire system, right? Including all the applications. And only when you're completely satisfied, you push the button and out comes a chip. He says, buildings are far less complex. Why can't we do that, right? Started with that thesis. His co-founder is a pretty well-known architect and a civil engineer. They've been at it now for 5 years or 4 years, and now they focused on the healthcare industry first. They won Kaiser, they won Lee Cushing Foundation, they've just won Sutter, right? And the reason we are winning this is literally our competition is architectural firms who have no idea. Right? And it's a complete different space. We just don't have competition. Our issue right now is what business not to take because we're still scaling. We're still a startup, right? But what do? We actually literally do everything. The way we won the first one was when we asked the customer, what's your criteria? They were trying to build a hospital in Bakersfield or something, and they said, your criteria should be how many patients a day? Yeah. So we said, how many patients a day do you want to see? What do you think is the demographic of those patients? What is the wait time you would like for those patients, right? What is the cost you would like to see between doctor, nurse, and patient ratios? What is the OpEx you would like to see? And we actually took that and modeled that and said, could you build a building to fit that? Right? They'd never heard of that. They'd never seen that. In chip programming, these are simple constraints. This is not a big deal, right? So that's one company. We have another company called Cellworks. Some of you might know it. And this was, again, partly accidental. 3 founders, a husband-wife team and a co-founder. And the 2 co-founders had actually done 2 startups before in the EDA space, in the chip design space. And they overheard the wife talking to a colleague. And the discussion was, you're lucky in the drug discovery world if you find one drug that makes it to market in your lifetime. And they said, "You kidding? In the technology world, every 3, 4 years, something new happens and we just keep doing new things." So they said, "Why is this an issue?" So if anybody knows the drug development industry, it's considered $1 billion a drug, right? Turns out the reason is, it's very simple. In the drug discovery world, the pharmaceutical companies think of our body as a black box. So they put in things and they wait to see what happens, right? So the best example I can give you is, probably most of you take Advil or Tylenol for headaches or something, right? Probably you take Claritin. Do you know if you can take the two together? Both are over the counter, right? You don't know. And the reason is, these things are tested on the human body in a complete black box. If you don't mind holding the question, he wants me to. So first, the word big data is a bunch of bullshit. So let's be very clear. And the answer is yes, but there's much more nuances to that. But it's actually simpler than that. What they did is very simple. Today, when you are on the road, if there's an accident on 101 near the airport, right, you can predict which are the side streets where the traffic will get congested, correct? Now, it turns out in drug discovery, the biggest issue is not efficacy. Everybody knows that this molecule will work on the liver or the heart or the lung. The problem is not the efficacy, it's the toxicity. What else will it impact? So these guys said, why can't I build a map of the human body? And the map, the nodes are basically the tissues. And they essentially downloaded 10 million papers from the PubMed, took it down into your big data models, and created cellular pathways, right? And today, they have 7 drugs in trial. 2 have been licensed by 2 pharma companies, 3 more, and they are in cancer, they are in personalized medicine, they're doing a whole bunch of things. Bunch of people who had never dealt with the human body or the drugs, but working with a well-known researcher in the life sciences field and then doing this, right? So the point here is, you want to go multidisciplinary, look for different things. InventSense is a company which we had funded in 2004. And this was, there were 2 companies that came off this thesis. And the thesis in 2004 was very simple. The human-computer interface had not changed in 30 years, right? Keyboard and mouse. We forget, but it's been 30 years. So at that time, we were looking at this saying, what could we do to enhance it? And I had actually invested from my angel fund in an ophthalmologist who had come to me complaining that for 50-year-olds and others, this is a convenient device, but boy, it's a small screen, it's hard to see, and it's a little hard to input. So he said, how do you enhance it? So he had said, look, as a human being, when I do this, I want it to magnify. When I do this, go to the next page. He says, why can't I do that? I said, lovely, brilliant idea. He had a bunch of patents. Unfortunately, a year later, we discovered he had patents, but no idea how to do anything about it, right? So when Steve Nasri, who was the founder of InventSense, came along, and he had done this company, he had done 5 companies before that, and the 6th company was a disaster in the optical communication space, and he had this technology in the MEMS space. And we said, you have solved how to manufacture it, but the market we need to go after is the consumer market, right? And we started there at a time when I had a hard time finding a co-investor for my, I was willing to lead. I went to like 6 people just saying, guys, I love this idea, let's go. Nobody knew how to deal with it because most VCs are used to a frame of reference. Most VCs are used to saying, are you in cloud? Are you in social? Are you in the app world? We were in neither, right? So it was a hard one to get a co-investor. We did. The good news is, and there's an interesting story here, but the good news was they made a breakthrough. Today they are, if anybody plays in Internet of Things, most of the motion-related sensors are theirs in most devices. Okay? Zspace is a 3D computing company, and literally it's the world's first 3D interactive computer. And you got to see it to believe it. They're just getting accepted into all the education markets. If anybody's kids goes to Los Altos School District or Bullis Charter or any of these schools, they've just started getting deployed in labs. Okay, I am done. Thank you. Am I staying here?
Thank you, Amit. Very insightful, lots of great examples. I'm sure a lot of inspiring examples for a number of entrepreneurs who want to start something. So I'm going to ask one question, then open it to the audience because I'm sure they're waiting to ask you even more questions. So question is simple. Let's say number of entrepreneurs come to you, right? For you to invest in them. Of course, a lot of entrepreneurs also complain these VCs don't invest in the early stage. They want you to show some traction, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure as an entrepreneur, you've seen that also in your entrepreneurial life. So what are those 3 or 4 things you look at in the entrepreneur or the team of entrepreneurs that will make you say, okay, I'm going to invest or work with these guys?
Sure. If you don't mind, can I give a slightly longer answer? So first, VCs do suck, and I'm one of them, right? And I want to be very clear. The reason we suck is we think we are gods and we know jack shit about things, right? So we are throwing darts the same way that you are. So your biggest challenge is figuring out how you and the VC line up throwing the dart at the same dartboard, right? And I'm not exaggerating a bit. So let me give you the variables involved from the VC side, because you should be aware of this. As he said, I've been on both sides of it. I deal with this issue at Artiman. Depending on the partner, does the partner have capacity? Because the biggest nuisance with us VCs is we'll never say no to a meeting, right? We are happy to take a meeting, that's our job. You may even have a great meeting, right? Quite often you'll be baffled saying, why the heck did I not get a follow on me? Remember, VCs have constraints regarding, does that partner have capacity? Does the partnership really believe in deals like that? Number 3, do they have the money? Okay. Number 4, are they really leads or are they followers? Right? And these are just some of the high-level variables. So you have to do your homework on the VCs. It's a very important aspect of it. Having said that, and I'm going to now specifically talk about Ottoman, from our standpoint, because we are completely multidimensional, we really look at any sector. One of the things we look for foremost is the quality of the entrepreneur. And the reason is because we are trying to do these white space deals, we know it's harder. We know you have to navigate a lot more. So we are really looking for either the individual or the team to have the quality. In fact, if the idea is not all that great, but if the entrepreneur is world class, quite often we have said, hey, would you mind doing something else, but we'd love to fund you. We are happy to do that. Within the partnership, know who the partners are. Some of us look at life sciences, some of us look abroad, some people look at only tech, and most of our partners do describe what they are, and most of us are hopefully good enough to share with each other, and which we do. For us, the key issue is white space. So if it's a generic deal, or if it's the 50th company, and hey, I can help you with transitioning, private hosting and public hosting, private cloud and public cloud. Guys, heard that a lot. Not the white space for us. But if you have something very different, we're happy to talk. Second thing, hopefully we'd be happy to bring, if you don't have an idea, but you think you're fairly good at something, but you want to at least brainstorm, we actually love doing that. And so we'd be happy to do that. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, let me open it to the audience. Okay, one question to Naresh, then we'll go to others. I know he's anxious.
Mike, you want to?
Yeah, Mike.
Okay. Amit, first of all, I must compliment you. I have been a charter member.
Can you bring your mic to
I have been a charter member for over a decade, and this is one of the most insight and the best presentation and the very holistic presentation that I have seen or heard. Okay, now let me come back to a very simple question and something you have been associated. You mentioned that how the companies, they are late, they disappear if you're not on the leading edge. Paint a picture for me for Cisco, where it will be 20 years from now, given where it is today. And one more thing, help me to understand how could a company pay $7 billion for Serent when on a good day, the best market size would have been $350 million.
I mentioned that we smoke good dope. Did I not? But there's actually a story on that. So actually, maybe there's a slightly broader question you're asking. Yeah. So one of the themes we have developed is every sector goes through about a 15 to 30 year cycle, right? And at about the 20th year, that whole thing peaks and it starts declining. If you really look at networking began in the late 80s. So it's now close to the 25th year. I absolutely believe Cisco is ripe for the taking, right? And the reason is not that they're stupid people or bad people or whatever. At some point, the inertia sets in. At some point, a lot of the bad habits also get institutionalized. At some point, you just lose that soul, that spirit of that company goes away. And so when that happens, if you're fast moving, if you have a unique idea, absolutely there's a place there. So I think Cisco or networking in general is ripe for the taking. Now, within the Cisco, the Seren story was, I actually wanted to, and I had a deal struck with Vinod at 250. Unfortunately, at Cisco was at that time a data networking company only. I was the guy trying to tell Cisco it had to get into the telecommunication side as well, or the transmission side as well. So while Ed was supporting me, this gentleman's name was Graham Fraser, who was head of routing. And he was what we call a data bigot, and his supporter was Don Lisman. So he said, hell no, you're not going to acquire it. So that internal battle, it kept escalating. At 750 million, I said no. But I was overruled because by then Don Lisman fell in love with it. And Vinod was smart enough to play him like the fiddle, and he did. So,
Okay.
I simply bow to Sequoia on that. I have no idea how to tell you. Now, they do have substantial revenue, so it's not a low revenue business. They do have substantial revenue, and Facebook desperately needs to keep reinventing itself. Unlike Google, they don't have a franchise that they have a lock on. So, sorry,
Hi, Amit.
Yeah, please go ahead.
This is Beena, and you talked about some of the really good success stories. Wondering if you can talk about some of the startups that failed and how they could have avoided failing.
You have all night? Look, so in fact, it's a great question because for most VCs, a 10 to 15% hit rate is what they look for. We do very few deals in any given fund, so we try to look for what we call a high hit rate, which is 40%. And so most companies do fail. I think if I really boil it down, it does boil down to people. And within people, the asset that I think is the most critical asset is intellectual honesty. Right? And it's the hardest to judge, but in the moment when somebody is not intellectually honest, right, you lose it. So simple example is, there's a fine line. So for example, intellectual honesty would declare saying, I really think my product is wrong, and therefore I should do something else. Okay, that's an easy one. But there is another case to be made to say, hey, I think the market is crowded and I should get out of it. Another school of thought could say, no, persevere, damn it. This is your idea, believe in it, have conviction. So there's no easy answer. But that intellectual honesty or the lack of it is the scariest one. And the lack of it is what kills most companies. And it boils down to people. Because ideas are always going to change. Markets change. It's your ability to change with that matters. And it's non-trivial. So.
Please.
Hi, Amit. I understand that you take 3 or 4 students, for EIRs a year and all that. As you know, the incubators, accelerators is the rage now in the last 4 or 5 years. If you go to San Francisco, there are probably 10 or 20 incubators and everything. Why not follow that kind of model where we can launch a lot more companies? I personally, saying this from my own experience, where we started about 20 companies. In a year, we started like 4 or 5 companies. We raised a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars. So I know it works. It's exact the same formula that you use, multidisciplinary kind of thing. Of course, we look at the life sciences field a lot more than the technology field.
So look, we are not 500 startups. and we truly don't know how to spray and pray. We just don't do that. We focus on the individual, and once we have an EIR, like I said, there's only one entrepreneur EIR who did not get funded, and that was because of the 2008 crash. He ran out of money because he had set some money aside. Unfortunately, he kept it in stocks, so he had to go get a job. But other than that, everyone gets funded. So our model is a little different. We spend about a year and a half, up to a year and a half, building the business plan, working with them. They have an Artiman card. They go to every university. We have a whole bunch of networks that we create for them. And it's a lot of work. And we don't know how to service 50 companies at the same time. We just don't know how to pay attention to that many people. So that's the reason why we stay focused and narrow.
So let me ask you a question to that incubator. Just came to my mind. Do you think there is an incubator, also bubble kind of a thing? It just seems like every Tom, Dick, and Harry has another incubator with 5 companies funded. And I'm just wondering where is the market and how many companies are there who are going to acquire them or go public?
My dad had told me one thing growing up. When the cab driver talks about the stock market, that's a dangerous sign. And we are getting close to that. So.
Okay. Anyway. Next question.
Heard the caveat.
You talk a lot about. I've just come in from Singapore, and my team's in India and Russia. You talked about multidiscipline. Do you have a
Can
view
you
on
bring up the mic closer to you?
Yeah, I'm from abroad. I want your views on multi-geography teams. Do you have a view on that, or do you want everyone in one place?
So we actually have an office in India, and we are actually, the Singapore government has approached us, and we are trying to see if we can help them with some things. They're trying to commercialize a lot of the things. They've spent billions of dollars on life sciences and other things, right? So they're trying to do that. It's hard. Multi-location is hard. Multi-geography is harder. Are there successes? Yes. There have been companies that have succeeded, but it requires a tremendous amount of communication and some more communication and then some more communication. The best example I cite is Goldman Sachs, right? You need to almost develop a communications framework like Goldman. You can have a meeting with Goldman in the East Coast, and that first thing in the morning here, if you meet an entirely different person, that person will have all the information about that meeting. They literally over-communicate. So the only answer to multi-geography teams is over-communication. But it's harder than regular. So in our case, we've had 3 companies outside the Bay Areas that were successful, but we had 3 failures as well. And mostly we blame it on ourselves because we couldn't spend enough time with the startup. Right? Well, our success was one in Allentown. We had a spectacular failure in Piscataway, New Jersey. So we did 2 companies in that belt. We had a failure in San Diego. We've had a success in, actually, I guess Oregon is close enough. So, but it's, and we just funded a company in Minneapolis. So we'll see.
Great. Next question. Anyone? Okay, let me ask before others think of other questions. So what do you, like for the entrepreneurs, where do you see some of the trends or opportunities, where do you think the entrepreneurs should focus on, those who are just thinking of starting a new?
Unfortunately, that question will narrow your choice down to Artiman, which is not necessarily the right thing. But I can tell you what we look for. We truly are completely sector agnostic. So let me give you an example of the last 4 companies we have funded. Maybe that will give you an answer. But one area we are looking at very seriously is how do we bring manufacturing back to this country? And so we are working on a bunch of things in that area, and we are working with a bunch of universities for that kind of problem solving. So that's an area of interest to us. The last 4 companies, so the most recent company we funded was, it's a company in magnets, right? And the reason is actually very simple. Turns out about 2/3 of our economy is driven by motors and generators and all of these things, and they all depend on magnets. And about 25 years ago, all magnets went from, so you have 2 kinds of magnets, electromagnets and permanent magnets. About 25 years ago, the permanent magnets went from ferrite to what are called rare earths. And about 10 years ago, people suddenly woke up and realized that 95% of all rare earths are mined in China. And they realized when China flexed their muscle and told Toyota, one fine day, you're going to pay 30% more for this. That rattled the US cages. And in the heart of the meltdown, they started funding quietly $200 million a year to 24 universities to figure out an alternative. And we've been working with some of these agencies and stuff. And so about 3.5 years ago, we started working with the agency. They narrowed it down to 3 universities by then. By about 2 years ago, they had narrowed it down to 1 university and 1 prof. And we worked with them for the last 2 years, and we finally just funded the company. So
That's great.
yeah. Another company we did was a company, it's actually a company called Runnables. We just did that deal. It's focused on software development, but an entirely different way. The simple thesis is today, so if you remember 5 to 10 years ago, if you were in software development, open source was not a good thing. If you got acquired, they wanted to clean out all your open source and stuff. Today, most engineers use open source modules and libraries. So what this company and the founder came out of Amazon Web Services, what he said is, he wanted to create an environment where a developer could pick any module and create a VM and spin up a whole environment, test it completely in one shot, and if it works, boom, you can take it straight to deployment. So we just funded that. We funded a company in fish foods. Right? Well, fish food is the wrong thing. So I'll tell you what it is. It converts food waste into proteins. Right? And it was an accidental discovery by some scientists at the Colorado School of Mines. And what they focus on is they accidentally stumble upon this fact that these bacteria that they're genetically engineered were, if you put them in food waste, would take the waste and convert it into proteins. And they got intrigued by it. And the model that they've picked up is they go to food processing plants, but today the sludge that comes out, they either pay somebody to take it and take it away, or they pay a farmer to put it on their land. So these guys go in and they say, you don't need to pay anybody. You're allowed to put this little plant of equipment next to you, and we convert it to protein. We'll sell it. 70% of it gets converted to protein. The rest is waste, but it's reduced down to 30%. And they sell it. The market they've gone after is fish meal. And turns out, why fish meal? Again, people forget. We all realize that the number of fish in the ocean are decreasing. So fish farming is becoming a big deal. Hey, when you farm a fish, you have to feed the fish. People forget that. When you're fishing, you never thought about feeding them. Well, it turns out, and the way you fish are carnivores, and the way they eat little fish. So the way people used to feed the fish is fish meal. Fish meal price has gone from $300 a ton to $1,800 a ton today in the space of 10 years. And there's a huge shortage. They've tried proteins. So these guys, what they found is the protein that they develop is actually the best compatible to regular food. Right? And so they've lined up a whole bunch of contracts on the other end. Pet foods, it goes into a whole bunch of other things. So we literally are completely diverse. Sorry? So when they did the test, there was a test done with FDA approval and all that. Not only were the fish apparently good, but the people who ate them are still alive. So, yeah.
5 years ago, the peak catch worldwide was 115 million tons of seafood. It has gone to 79 million tons of food. This is the rate at which we are depleting the ocean, because we are just going literally and scoop up the entire floor, and especially the China. And
so
Japan.
Just talking about fish food a little bit more. So the number of fish farms are increasing at the rate of, I'm trying to convert it, but it's, they go by acreage. And it's something of the order of 1 million acres a year is what they're increasing. China is the biggest. Canada actually started that. US is finally waking up. We had a setback because of the flooding or the oil issues on the south, because that's where a lot of the fish farms were. So there are no wild salmon. It's going to be a rare beast. So.
Hi, Amit. My name is Yusuf Mamsa. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that you raised too much money for one of your startups, and that was a mistake. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah. It's truly just standard human behavior, right? If you feed a kid too much, sooner or later that kid will become obese, will become sluggish. And the startup is no different. When you have a false sense of security that you have a lot of money, you do slack off. You do get a little slow. You become you let your guard down. It's hard to maintain that tenacity and that focus when you have too much money. So my most spectacular failure, somebody was asking about my failure, was a company called Forturis where we raised probably 250 million and had probably the world's best team when it came to optical related stuff. And it was the most spectacular failure. And the reason was when they had too much money, they never saw the warning signs and reacted as rapidly because they felt they had the comfort of having the money. So too much money is always a problem. The team was good, but it's an issue that it comes in where you have that safety net. At the end of the day, if you raise a kid in Silicon Valley, we live in a bubble. If that kid has not seen what the rest of the world looks like, no matter how good the heart is, how good the kid is, they don't have the exposure.
But team also, in that case, market also, right? Because if you think about photonic switches, they're still not there after 14 years.
But the point was they should have gotten out and reacted much faster. They didn't.
Exactly.
So,
Please.
Amit, so I think some of your investments that you have made are very practical, and that's very unseen in the valley. So one question I have is, what is the source? I mean, where do you source these ideas from?
Boy, that was a tough one for a long time. So we are known as the crazy guys to go to, right? So there are three sources for anybody: entrepreneurs, lawyers, accountants. These are the typical sources that you get from.
Right.
And we have now a fourth source because we have developing a network with the universities. But it's word of mouth. Earlier, we used to literally, I was not kidding when I said we would go beg our friends who are entrepreneurs and say, just do a white space deal with us, do this, do this. So for example, Virident, which was our company, Kumar was an entrepreneur we had funded before, and we just told him, you're going to be an ER with us. You're not going to leave this building, right? I mean, we had to drag people to it. Hopefully, as the word of mouth spreads, we don't need a lot of people. That's the good news for us is we are not in the volume game.
Yeah.
We just need.
Not a Y Combinator.
We are not a Y Combinator.
On the same line, so the next question is, when you look to invest in some company or some individual, correct? What are the characteristics that you look for, which says, wow, this is the guy I really want to go after, correct?
Very good question. Somebody who knows what they're doing and is pragmatic about what they don't know. Somebody who has got the tenacity, but the humility. Somebody who has a focus and a vision, and they're willing to go all out on that, right? It's so, and it's hard, but you find these, and we are not looking for too many, so you do find them. So.
By now, Amit has a very sharp, intuitive sense also for.
Well, I hope it was intuitive. It's called, when you take enough beatings and you have enough losses, you also kind of say, shit, I think I recognize that pattern. So.
Okay.
Hi, Amit. Great to see you again after quite some time. It's a pleasure to hear you in person and your whole story. My question is related to the too much money aspect that you mentioned earlier. And this is related to, of course, pumping in too much money into an entrepreneur is detrimental, as you explained. In the case of the overall VC industry, as you see, VC investing is almost at an all-time high or at the peaks. As you mentioned, there's a lot of startup incubators, as we've talked about, and so forth. So my question is related to, given these observations, what is the industry, returning in terms of, returns, IRRs, and where do you see, if you care to share, or if it's private, it's okay, lead firms as yours, as well as other lead firms in the industry. What's the range of returns, and where do the lead firms stand in terms of returns?
Yeah, I mean, so venture has sucked for a long time. Let's be very clear. And it's a very bipolar thing. There are a few firms which do very well, and most of the firms are in the land of the living dead. And look, we think we are doing well. We think we have good returns, and at least we have fooled our investors long enough. but it's a tough one because a lot of the people get excited by the the big deals and the big numbers, and they don't realize the seamier side of venture, which is there's a boatload of failures, and there's a lot of funds which are dying a quiet death. So, but I guess it's part of the ecosystem. That's part of life. So.
You've spoken a lot about too much money. Let's go the other tack now. What do you think when an entrepreneur comes to you and you say how much you need, and he doesn't pick a big enough number?
Actually, that's a very fair question. Somebody knows business when they know what is the right amount to ask for. So that's actually one of the little things we test on. So one of the biggest things I have a pet peeve on is a lot of people come to us with a lot of spreadsheets, right? And here's my problem with spreadsheets. I'm betting you I can be a better spreadsheet jock than most of you, right? It means nothing, right? So triangulate three things. Always triangulate. So the three things are, if you say here's the TAM, then you go back and say here's where the cost of entering the market is, and here's what it means to sell into accounts. Because if you don't triangulate, TAM means nothing. So cost of entering a market, meaning, okay, it'll take me X million dollars to develop the product. Am I going to sell direct? Am I going to sell through a channel, right? All of these take time. So when you show me a plan and that shows you are going to hit the hockey stick of $100 million in 4 years, 90% of the time we say bullshit. And the reason is, if you take 3 years to develop, and generally, there's a very simple rule we have. Even if you're a hot company, very hot company, you go from 0 to 10 million reasonably well. 10 to 30, we have seen a few companies do it. Between 10 to 30, you will hit a roadblock. Somebody asked about big data. Let me tell you, 99% of the big data companies have revenues less than 30 million. Right? So the point here is, you have to know what are the practical limits to building a business. People forget Google took 10 years to build to what it became in 2004. Right? People just forget that.
I suggest that I come from the semiconductor industry, and you're mentioning the word TAM. Maybe I'm naive. Not everybody may know what TAM is. And also another term you said come diagonally, that another term called SAM. What SAM you're trying to hit out of that TAM, you may want to clarify for the audience.
It's good. That's a good Intel term, right?
Is this something people don't know?
Yeah.
So, sorry. So I think this is a good point he's making. When people talk to us about markets, I'm going to go maybe a little more one-on-one on this then. You think about markets as, so for example, if somebody comes and tells me, the PC industry is a $100 billion market, right? Okay, there's nothing wrong with that statement, but it's a completely irrelevant statement, right? So one rule in life, and I've learned this, is all of us are ADD. I have the attention span of a fly, maybe a giant fly, right? And what that means is, if you waste your words on a bunch of baloney, which is not relevant to your business, right? It's a problem. Second lesson, since we VCs are ADD, we will try to take you into orthogonal things. So if on your slide, you have a stupid statement, I guarantee you, my partnership, forget everybody else, somebody will be a wise ass and say, that can't be true. Now, it may not even be relevant to your business, but you just lost 20 minutes on a discussion which is random, right? So what does market mean? Don't tell me a $100 billion PC market. So total addressable market simply tells you that, so let's take the case of, because this is a real issue for us, the case of Adidas, which is the construction company. First thing he said is, it's a $6 trillion market. I said, not only will you be taken out of the meeting, you will be stamped on your butt so that you never show up again, right? Because don't use numbers which are completely irrelevant. Yeah, construction is a $6 trillion global industry. It's like the government putting out a statistic. It's not a TAM. It's not relevant to you. Now, you can say that, look, in the US, in the hospital sector, it's about a $600 billion TAM. So TAM is, okay, giving you an idea at its fullness. If you ever reached infinity, that could be what it could be. Then there's SAM. What can you actually service? What is the market you can truly hit? So for instance, in the US, there are two things that can happen. One is a greenfield construction, and the other is what I would call a hospital is 50 years old and it has to be remodeled completely. But out of that 600 billion, what people forget to tell you is, well, a lot of it is simply they modified this room or that operating theater got modified. That's a huge bunch of the spend. That's not construction. That's just remodeling. So that's a SAM. And then within that, right, what can you address? So for instance, yeah, there's a hospital being constructed, but it's going to be done by a group which is internal to the organization. Right? That's not your market. So you really have to really get to the market that you can hit, and that's a SAM. So you want to get to a number which people can say, I can see you getting there, right? Another suggestion, be more conservative, not more aggressive with your numbers. It's okay for the VC to say, I think you're underselling it. And you can say, yeah, probably, but I just wanted to make sure it's a conservative number. Sorry, off on a diatribe. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Tarun. Going back to the previous question about how much money should an entrepreneur raise. So once you have a product market fit, you can put numbers onto, so these are my acquisition costs, these are my marketing costs. But before the product market fit, say maybe where a lot of companies are, you exactly don't know what your market is and what your product is going to be in the next 6 months or 1 year.
No, so I think that you're talking at different stages of a company. So at a seed stage, right, what are you doing? You're raising seed money, right? So you raise money from a lot of angels. The problem with that is, as you said, you don't know what is the right amount of money to raise. So what you always try to do is work back from a milestone. Pick a milestone that you think is appropriate for you to raise the next round. So the milestone could be, look, guys, just give me $250,000. I'll figure out the product. I'll have a spec for a product. But at least you have a milestone. The problem is when it's open-ended. Or, for example, when somebody comes and tells me, all I need is $1 million. Give me the $1 million. I want to go sell into this market. And I keep telling him, sell what? In $1 million, it's a bridge to nowhere. Right? So a classic case that you see right now is a lot of these app companies are dying. People don't talk about it. How do I know they're dying? When they come to me for funding. I'm not known as the app guy. Right? And the reason they come for funding is they all get these incubators giving them money. But without thinking through where does it lead to? So you have to have a bridge to somewhere. Right? So bridge to something is the key piece. I don't care what that something is, at least find a milestone which makes sense. Right? So if you're at the seed stage, okay, I'll create a business plan. Right? And here's what I'm going to propose in the business plan. I'm going to address these markets, this kind of thing, but I'll come back with a business plan. Okay, somebody can put their hands around it. It's when you're too vague that's a problem.
Next question. Last question. Amita, you had a question? Please.
Nope. If we get people... No, it depends on the stage of the company for us. So we are very early stage investors. So by and large, we tend to have conversations with people. And we get to know people. And sometimes, so most of them come with very little ideas. Or they have a generic idea about a space. And they say, I'm thinking about this space. What do you think? And we talk about it and we maintain a relationship. And then we get companies on the other end with a full prototype and a full... So it doesn't matter. We are looking for is this a big market? And is this a big opportunity? And is this the right person to start working with? So
what's the success rate of somebody coming up with an idea versus somebody following with a prototype and a demonstration?
Success rate for getting funded?
Yeah, funded and going ahead.
Same. Yeah, no difference for us. So,
Andrew, last question from Andrew.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about how you assess risk? What other
How'd you get to our formula? Look, I wish there was an easy answer to risk. So number one, we don't care about other VCs. So for us, by the way, that's a good point you're raising. A lot of VCs always worry about what are other VCs doing. We care the reverse, meaning if there are too many VCs doing those things, it's not interesting to us. So we don't care about other VCs. How do we assess risk? So you're raising a great point, and maybe I should talk a little bit about that. A lot of entrepreneurs come to us saying, look, just give me $50,000. Let's pocket change. We just don't invest like that. For us, whether I had a $50,000 check or a $10 million check, it's the same thing. And what I mean by that is until I've fallen in love with either the individual or what they want to do, I won't write a check. So the biggest thing for us is this idea right? Now, how do we look at risk? In our case, the risks are magnified. So for example, we knew nothing about the construction industry when we started, right? So we spent 2.5 years trying to understand the market, right? The dynamics of it. So what do we look for? We are looking to understand where are the margins, right? So simple things we always ask entrepreneurs to do is, guys, follow the dollars, right? So and I'll use the construction industry as an example. Who do you think if you look at a construction industry chain, you have architects, designers, you have engineers, you have what I would call contractor, as in the plumbers and all of those, the trade persons, the contractor, right? Who do you think makes the most money in that chain? And what do you think are the margins in the business? So somebody said interior designer, somebody said architects, neither. Huh? So yes, but in the trade, the highest margin is actually with the engineering firms, right? And let me define what high margins are for them. So for a general contractor, they actually make no margins. They make money on what I call change orders, okay? For an architect, most architecture firms are dying. That's why you'll see a lot of consolidation happening, right? So what you discover is you have to understand these little things. So what that means is there is no way an architect has any money to buy any technology. Just remember that. When a net margin of a business goes below 10 points, their ability to invest in R&D goes down dramatically. It's a very simple rule, right? Second, the first thing that a company tosses when their markets stop growing or start stagnating is they start throwing out R&D and some of the marketing. They start tossing that out of the window. Ironically, when the market really gets commoditized, they put all the money back into marketing and zero into R&D, right? So you have to understand which stage is the industry at. You have to really understand the ecosystem and then find a point of insertion. And at Adidas, we made a bunch of mistakes. We tried to partner with general contractors. We realized, oh shit, they're the guys who keep declaring bankruptcies every 2 years, right? Even the biggest ones. So you have to understand where to insert, what are the costs of insertion, how do you think about it. That's the biggest art, and that's non-trivial. And so for us, when we are entering all these markets, we always try to understand the ecosystem. Selling to tech is easy. We've all done that. Somebody at Oracle, somebody at Google, everybody knows somebody in one of these places. Hell, how the heck do you know how to sell to fish food? How do I know how to get to somebody in the pet food industry? How do I get to Li Ka-shing Foundation in China, right? And that's where the bigger issues come in. As technology starts selling into other markets, which we are beginning to do, it's not just Artiman, right? Steve Jobs was the first of it. An iPhone is nothing but an agglomeration of technologies and taking it into the consumer market. And you're going to see that happening in a bunch of other markets. Industrial is the next big wave happening. So we are definitely interested in anything related to changing the industrial landscape. Manufacturing, I mentioned. It is going to come back to this country. Very simple reason why. Our energy costs have now gone below China's. And when you factor in the arbitrage of shipping versus labor, and labor in China is going up, we have a real opportunity to create real industries here. So we kind of look for broader themes and see what we can do within that.
Okay, great.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks for putting up with me.
Let's give a big round of applause to Amit.